Welcome back to Bitwig. Today's modular concept is synthesis, as in sound synthesis. Now, there are many techniques for creating sounds synthetically. We tend to think they all have a similar purpose, which is to have timbres that evolve over time. And the most common way to think of this is usually subtractive synthesis, where you've got some kind of filter removing a section of the sound. Now, subtractive, you can still call it a kind of synthesis, but there's a filter available on everything you do these days. So instead of counting subtractive on its own, we're going to look at 6 or so other synthesis methods or ideas, all inside of the Polymer instrument. So let's begin. Now, before we start with the idea of pulse width modulation, let's just look at the Polymer device by itself for a moment. It is 3 slots, one where you select an oscillator, one where you select a filter, and one where you select an amplitude envelope. As I already alluded, today we're mostly focusing on the oscillator, and the filter is really just the coloring that we can throw in afterwards. There's also a sub-oscillator, so if I were to pull this all the way to the left, I'm only hearing the primary oscillator currently. If I drag it all the way to the right, I'm only hearing the sub-oscillator, and then typically some blend of the two in between is where we go. There's also a noise generator, which is blended after. So I blend the sub and the primary, and now I hear only the noise and no oscillators, or only the oscillators and no noise, or something in between. The filter has its own envelope generator, which we can use for other purposes, which we'll see. There's also a high-pass filter, some panning, per voice gain, velocity sensitivity. As always, there is a help view that gives you the brief overview here, and then depending on what components you have selected, gives you their full details below. So all of the parameters are fully explained over there in the help view, if that is what you are looking for. So let's begin our synthesis quest. No sub, no noise, no filter. We're mostly going to kill those things today and just start with the oscillator. So there is our old friend, Sawtooth, who's pretty typical, especially in subtractive places, because this presents all harmonics at slowly decreasing values in terms of their amplitude. If I were to switch over to the pulse wave, now you are seeing every other harmonic. See, half of them have just disappeared. Now there's a reason for that. The default pulse wave is a square wave, which means 50% up, 50% down, a perfect square. Here's a little math tip. Think of it the other way. So 1/2 is 50%. Every second harmonic is missing. If I were to change this value to 1/3, now every third harmonic is missing. So there actually is predictability to the math here. Now, what makes pulse width modulation an interesting kind of synthesis is, again, it's an easy way to change timbre over time. So we have a pulse wave. Let's just go ahead and grab an LFO, make it nice and slow. And once we are modulating pulse width, we now have pulse width modulation synthesis. So again, that slow changing of the pulse width is going to create timbre shifts and a bit of instant pad, if you will. But let's pretend, as one example, we're not going to look at every sound example today. We're really just focusing on synthesis. But since we're starting here, let's pick something quite different. Perhaps a step sequencer that is then hitting on the pulse width. Let's make it go a bit more extreme. Good. And then For whatever values are in here, we could start with some randomness. I kind of like that, because as you push to the extremes, you're creating a waveform so small that it's pretty extravagant and almost quiet in a sense. So again, modulation is a pretty big part of this. If I were to take our steps modulator and make it per voice, now for each note, well, now if I switch the mode to say, each new note randomizes its voice. And this is not the instant pad we were talking about a minute ago, but that is something. And there is value to pulse width modulation via the pulse oscillator. Let's move on to our second synthesis technique, which is phase distortion. The idea of phase distortion, again, for shifting modulation, is that we have a number of algorithms. In the phase 1 oscillator, there are 5, and then we can shift the position, which started as a sine wave over here and shifts to a saw. But then we've got other algorithms for different extravagant shapes that we can see, like this doubling. It kind of shifts back to a single. So again, if we're thinking about shifting timbres, this isn't a bad place. I mean, there's a reason that we have a filter envelope, but we could just take that exact same envelope and instead of assigning it to the filter, which is disabled right now, just assign it to the wave shape. And then we're going to have some of that morphing immediately per note. Or even have it start a little brighter so it's pushing through. Compared to subtractive and just using a filter or low-pass filter, one thing that's nice about phase distortion is at its primary position, you still have a sine wave. With a low-pass, even if I pulled the cutoff all the way down, you are now removing the fundamental and it disappears altogether. But that's something interesting about phase distortion. In a similar sense, if I were to look at our sine or triangle wave here in Polymer, they also have these skew parameters that work in a similar way, where it's kind of misreading the waveform, if you want to think of it that way, like phase distortion does, so that it gets pushed to a different place. So if I had either of those going, they already have this sensibility of morphing into a different wave shape or being read as a different wave shape, which can be interesting. Now, hard sync. In this technique, there is actually a relationship between the sub-oscillator and the primary oscillator, because there's this magical sync knob here. So there's a few more relationships than just sub is audio, main oscillator is audio. Sub can do some other things we'll see in a bit more detail in a second. But just to think about hard sync, the idea is that the primary oscillator will be going, and then the secondary oscillator will be resetting it. So in this case, the sub oscillator, once I enable the sync button, every time it crosses a certain threshold or at its frequency, it's now resetting the first oscillator, which turns the pitch control of the first oscillator, as long as you set it higher, into something that's going to get folded and reset and thereby create a more interesting spectrum. So here you see the full sine wave's making it, it's starting a whole nother sine wave, and then it's getting chopped off immediately at the regular frequency here. So suddenly, pitch control is actually timbre control, which can be very interesting. Now this one will work on any of the oscillators that we've got. So we could go over to Sawtooth, say. And if I said let each note velocity control this pitch, remember pitch is suddenly a timbre control. So Or if we want classic Miami Vice, which we do, then I could take the random modulator, say don't advance at any frequency, just stay where you are, but for each new note, create a new random value, and then use that to modulate the frequency. So with or without the velocity, having those different random values created per note creates something interesting. Now, even forgetting the sub-wave for a minute, and we'll get rid of those two modulations because we don't want to be in crazy pitch land now that sync is off. Additionally, to any oscillator being syncable, the sawtooth and the pulse actually have their own sync control, which kind of does the logic inside of saying, oh, there is this rate at which you need to reset your waveform. So it's exactly the same thing. We could just go ahead and assign the random over here if you're happy with those two waveforms to start with. And again, then all of the other controls are available as well. So that's a brief peek at hard sync. Moving on to phase modulation, technique number 4. A lot of techniques here. Phase modulation is modulating the phase or frequency, if you're thinking of frequency modulation, because they have the same result, of the carrier, the oscillator we're hearing, by a modulating oscillator, in this case, the sub. Now, I alluded a minute ago to all these sub relationships, so let's go to the expanded device view for a moment, maybe hide the device panel, and just see the patch underneath everything. We're not going to talk our way all the way through it. We do see the filter disabled, which is nice. So what I see is the primary oscillator here. What I see is the sub oscillator with its main signal going straight out to a sync input, which is toggled on or off. That's if you hit that big sync button. Why not see it? There you go. So those are tied together to say, yes, I'm syncing the primary oscillator, or no, I am not. Now, after the output of the sub, there is a scaler here, which is letting us multiply the value to say, oh, the sub either has an envelope applied, which happens to be the filter envelope generator, or it's getting multiplied by 1. So when it's multiplied by 1, this is just turned on all the time. When it switches, it toggles over to the other state, and now the filter envelope generator is being used to shape it. And if you have an eagle eye, you probably just saw this little button flipping off and on as it happened. So the point is there's a lot inside of the expanded device view if you're just trying to get an overview, kind of a map of the thing. Or if you would prefer to, let's say, shape things that aren't available on the front panel, like the curves of the filter envelope generator, or the color of the noise, or the roll-off of the high pass, there's some other things that are available down in there. So back to the phase modulation topic for a moment. I start with the sine wave, and as I open the amount of modulation coming from the sub, right now these are tuned to the same frequency. As I start bringing that open, I am getting a bit of an undulation of different sidebands and harmonics in the end. And again, this is the sort of thing I would probably want to animate directly. The common metaphor is the cutoff filter, so let's steal that filter envelope generator again. Go ahead and let it open, nice and slow, then fall down a little bit. And for each note, you have an evolution of tone, or timbre. Now, one thing that's interesting that you're seeing is this is not quite a linear process like it would be with the cutoff filter or even with phase distortion for the most part. The amplitude of the partials are coming up and down. Even the fundamental is disappearing at a certain point, which is unique and nice. if we change the frequency of the sub, you are basically changing the distance between the harmonics that are occurring. That's going to be quite bassy that everything's close together now. So depending on how much mud you want, or if you make it a non-sine wave, how much brightness you want. So there's a few interesting controls in there. And one other variation, a different kind of phase modulation, is if we go back to the phase 1 oscillator for a moment, it has this feedback setting. So ignore all of the phase distortion bit. Let's just leave it kind of sine wave-esque for a moment. See, we're still doing modulation over here. So, works on any oscillator, as guaranteed. Now, turning that off for a moment, this feedback actually feeds back the original oscillator into the phase modulation input of itself. And if you do that with a sine wave, you actually now get a pretty regular, you don't see the harmonics jumping up and down quite so much and dancing. It's just a bit more flat and a bit more predictable. So that can be a nice place to start too, if that's what you're looking for. And as we like feedback and random and things blowing up, just keep turning that knob. You'll end up in some fun places. And again, a reason to have a filter on at a certain point. Now, technique number 5 is a little different and a little all-encompassing: wavetable synthesis. So there is a wavetable oscillator. It can load these various wavetables that you can then cycle through their different shapes and their different positions. So this is not sampling, please do not email me, but it's like sampling in the sense that you have to load content, otherwise it's not going to play anything back. And what's funny, if you start looking around, you're going to find some of the techniques we've already talked about. You're going to find some pulse width modulation, some phase distortion, some FM stuff, or even some noise, or whatnot. There are all kinds of tables in here, and ones that you can import other formats that can be read by Bitwig. How about marimba? Ooh, I like things that go to silence. I like an instrument that knows how to be quiet sometimes. So, how about a ramp modulator? It's kind of like an envelope, but all it's doing is going from point A to point B. So if the arrow's up, we're starting at no modulation and going to whatever the maximum modulation is. In this case, I just want to read the wavetable. Maybe curve it a little. Sounds a little more chiffy. Yeah. If I wanted to, I might put some velocity on the curve or something to give it a little bit more character, but we're being simple. What's interesting with the ramp modulator is that it can kind of become a sequence tool. It has a loop button. So now, if you're in a polyphonic type mode like we are, kind of has a life of its own at a certain point. That's fun. Now, the next topic I wanted to talk about is actually unison techniques, and wavetable is a pretty good place to start. So for a moment, I'm just going to kill that ramp modulation, stay somewhere in the middle. Maybe we can get some other type of... I think there's some fun fractally bells up here. Yeah, let's go for that. Sine wave-ish to craggy, mountainy. Now, normally you'd have that animating, but again, we just kind of want to talk about technique. So I'm going to switch over to the other page, because Wavetable has another page. Right now, Unison is off. So Unison technique's the idea that we want to layer multiple things together. In this case, each strike of the keyboard, instead of triggering one note right now, might trigger 5 notes or 7 notes or 16 notes. Let's take 5 as a nice middle. Now, if we go to the fat mode, you're just gonna get 5 voices kind of stacked and detuned all over each other. So that's the nice cheeseburger version of it, where it's kind of just slithering around, and that's what you want a lot of the time. But we got a couple interesting modes here. The focused mode actually says, okay, for the voice that is the most in tune, it will be the most center and the loudest. And the 4 other voices that are progressively more detuned will be progressively quieter and panned out to the sides, because we've got spread open. So that's kind of nice, just to create a little bit of a tunneling about it, but not totally distracting. And then complex is actually the joy of prime numbers. A lot of values are getting put together that create kind of almost polyrhythmic relationships between the various voices. And because of that, if you are doing something like turning hard sync on, it resets a little bit smoother. All sorts of interesting things. Now, like I said, like a sampler, you have to load content to try these things out. So they're going to sound very different in each patch and with each file. So please try it yourself. There's even a button here to say, I would like that the phases of each voice are also spread out. Which can lead to a very different sound, especially in stereo, especially in headphones, especially when you're listening carefully to what you're doing and changing all these settings. So that's a bit on the Unison modes in Wavetable, but beyond the Wavetable itself, 2 more things worth noting. First of all, any oscillator, because every module is stereo here, has a detune, a linear Hertz detune. So that just sounds sharp or flat until I realize that little button is a toggle to do stereo detune, to put one side up and one side down. And now, suddenly, whatever we are working with any oscillator, the left and right sides are being detuned slightly differently. So that's a nice quick way to add some stereo feel to things. And yes, everything else in the signal path, from the from the filter and the high pass here, all the way through the effects chain, those are going to be stereo as well. So you can get some quite interesting results. On top of that, there's a whole oscillator we didn't even look at yet. It is a Unison swarm oscillator, which is to say, let's close the spread. If you like one sawtooth, you might like 8 of them, and to have them all tuned slightly differently. Oh, and look at that. I accidentally left stereo detune on, because yes, 8 sawtooths detuned can become 8 on the left slightly detuned from the 8 on the right. That works too. Maybe you want sine waves. You can get some nice spooky forest stuff, which I wholly endorse. And again, you want to do phase modulation on top of that? Fine. You want to do hard sync on top of that? You could. It's going to mess up some of our Unison relationships because you're going to be resetting frequencies at different intervals. Maybe hear the sub. A little noise in. There are a lot of quick ways to get things done here in Polymer. So just a quick tour of some synthesis available in some of our modulators. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.